Welcome back, grade 10s. This is lesson number 7, Ancient Globalization. So this is the beginning of a new unit. First unit of the year, related issue 1, covered chapters 1 through 4 of the textbook. This begins with chapter 5, but the textbook leaves a lot of gaps. So we are going to work outside the textbook and go all the way back to the Neolithic Revolution. So there's some nice links here before I get started. There's a link here to a 7-minute video that will look at globalization and some of the dimensions like economic globalization and cultural religious globalization. And this link will help to answer the question, why does mankind globalize? And by looking at that, we can look at the nature of globalization and the nature of mankind. Here's a documentary on the history of beer that I will be giving you some summary notes for. And there's some additional summary notes in the digital textbook as well. And also today we looked at some sources connected to these two links as well. So in summary, we're looking at ancient globalization so that we can get a better understanding of the nature of globalization. Why did we first globalize? And as we look into globalization, it becomes a mirror that allows us to look into ourselves. So this evidence should help us with some of our essay writing in our near future. Some of these dates, by the way, these are approximate dates, subject to some controversy. Some historians would change the dating. These are the dates that most people recognize today. So it has been suggested that mankind has been on Earth for about 100,000 years in our present form. And for those first 90,000 years, we lived a primary hunting and gathering existence. But about 12,000 years ago, so in about 10,000 BCE, there was a revolution, the Neolithic Revolution. And Neolithic Revolution will help spark globalization, ancient globalization. And to some extent, we need to answer the question, why was there a Neolithic Revolution then? If the Neolithic Revolution will lead to globalization, and this course is a study of globalization, it should be natural that we're asking the question, well, why did we have this revolution? What was it? Why did we have it? So to some extent, looking before the Neolithic Revolution, that hunting and gathering existence, we want to highlight a few things. One thing is that the world population was quite low. So when I say quite low, there would have been less than 10 million people on the entire planet. Currently, we are closing in on 8 billion people on the same planet. So one of the measures of the hunting and gathering lifestyle was that the Earth was quite depopulated of mankind, and therefore, to some extent, there may have been less opportunity for man to cooperate in large groups. Another obstacle that they faced for most of that hunting and gathering time period was an ice age. So there was an extended ice age that lasted for all of those 90,000 years where we were hunting and gathering. So during that time, there would have been areas of this planet that would have not been hospitable for hunting and gathering civilizations. So our numbers would have been low, but our numbers would have also been quite isolated to smaller pockets of the planet where hunting and gathering was sustainable. Now, the last major ice age ended about 12,000 years ago, and not coincidentally enough, but it also so happens that about 12,000 years ago, the first real building, lasting building was built, in this case by Stone Age men, and the building itself was a temple. So being that the first permanent, and I say permanent because it lasted 2,000 years, but the first permanent structure was a temple, gives us some insight into why man would come together and cooperate and build a structure. Why did they need a temple? So we can look at it and say one of the reasons for globalization is religion. That a temple is a place for religion, and a temple is also a gathering place for economics. So here with the building of a temple in present-day Turkey 12,000 years ago, we can see that both economics and religion were driving globalization. Unfortunately, it's mostly lost to history as to, what was the religion that they were practicing in that temple? What were their values that they were promoting? But we can, relating it to other temple-based societies, we can make some assumptions as to the impact that religion had on convincing them to together create this monument and this gathering place that was a temple. And the temple became the center of their community, which would grow into a city-state. About 1,000 years ago, the city of Jericho will be built. So Jericho is one of those ancient cities that is often credited as being the first or one of the first cities that mankind has built. Now, part of this story of the Neolithic Revolution is the domestication of both animals and agriculture. Now, the story of the domestication of agriculture is significant because we go from hunting and gathering to food producers. So we take control over our diet. And by having control over our food, it will allow us to some extent, specialize. Instead of everyone within the tribe being involved in hunting and gathering, now we can specialize because there's an economy of scale as the community can share the responsibility of producing food. Producing food is more predictable. So now we can free some people up to do other jobs. So now we'll have some specialization of labor. Some people can become permanent artisans. So now we're going to have a great golden age of art as there's an opportunity for more time to be devoted to art. We'll have some people that will become scribes and we'll see the advent of writing. But we'll also have different types of religious leaders. So this is where the impact of religion will also grow in society. So back to the domestication of food. It's been suggested there's two stories about the domestication of food. One story is that some of the gathering women from a hunting and gathering society noticed that the next year after they had been in an area, because they kept coming back to the same territories and they'd move as they ended up gathering the crops from an area, as they came back, they noticed that some of the crops had moved. So the crops used to be out in that field over there, but now it's next to the path that they've been using. This very primitive path. It's not a formal road or anything, but the crop has now shifted to the path, and it would have taken a time period for them to figure out how that happened, but ultimately some of the women decided it's because they end up dropping some of the seeds out of the bags that they carried the seeds in, and where those seeds have been dropped, the next year when they come back, the crop is growing there. So then they decided, well, wait a minute, now we can control where the seeds are growing. And that's the advent of agriculture. So some would suggest that the Neolithic Revolution, the advent of agriculture, was due to some insight seen by women who were involved in the gathering part of a hunting-gathering society. There's another theory out there that the domestication of agriculture is a product of the domestication of barley itself. And barley was domesticated. Just going to close the door. It's not going to get rid of all the music from next door, but all right. Domestication of barley. Barley was not domesticated originally for bread, as you might assume. In fact, we have records showing that bread won't be really in use for a few hundred or a few thousand more years. But originally, barley was domesticated for beer. Now, there is some suggestion that beer was first created by accident, that those seeds in those bags that people were carrying, it might have rained on them and the seeds might have sprouted and gotten wet, and then it gets hot. So some of that happened by accident. The first beer was an accident. But when they drank it and they liked it, then they wanted to reproduce it. And they liked the effect that it had on them. So now they wanted to control the seed that they needed to grow it. But with that came an explosion of new inventions. So the advent of the plow to make it easier to harvest the barley. and the advent of irrigation to make it easier to grow the barley. And then they had to move the beer. So once the beer was created, now they had to move the beer from one area to another. Now we're going to need carts and wheels and things like that. Once they had lots of beer, they had to figure out, well, how much beer do we have? How much crops, how much land do we need to domesticate barley? So it leads to the advent of math, so that they could divide fields. Also, it leads to the invention of writing, so that they could claim ownership of the fields, and so that they could keep records of their agricultural process. So just from the accident discovery of beer leads to the invention of writing and mathematics, two of the signs of high culture. Along with bookkeeping and the invention of trade, these high culture civilizations of India and China and Egypt and maybe in the Mississippi Valley here in the Americas and the Nile, I mentioned Egypt, these civilizations will begin to prosper around 5000 BC. In Egypt specifically, beer will be used as a form of currency. So beer will be used as a form of currency as unemployed farmers will be paid in off-season with beer so that they could build the pyramids. So often a subject of much debate is, how did they build those pyramids? Short answer is with beer. They paid the unemployed farmers, while the farmers are just waiting for their crops to grow. They still need nutrition, the farmers do. And a basic food source for the ancient Egyptians was beer. And in fact, the beer that they were drinking was quite nutritious. So they end up using beer, ancient Egyptians, not only for nutrition, not only for currency, but also to cure sicknesses. And when we go back and we examine bones of Egyptians from 3,000 plus years ago, the bones will contain antibiotics that are not discovered until 1948. So tetracycline is discovered in 1948, but we discovered in the bones of ancient Egyptians from more than 3,000 years ago. And modern scientists have tried to figure out where are they getting this antibiotic from. And they decided, well, they had to be getting a lot of it because there's a lot of it in their bones. So it had to be part of their daily schedule and routine. So they checked it out. They checked out, well, what was in their diet, and the answer is beer. So they're getting antibiotics from beer. They're curing sickness from beer. They're using beer to pay for labor, so as a currency. Beer had already led to the invention of writing. And Egyptian writing, there's a symbol for beer that is reoccurring in many of their records. Beer led to math and even in the invention of will and agriculture and the plow. Unfortunately, these high cultures, in quotation marks, didn't mean it was globalization, and the ancient globalization was good for everyone. After the Neolithic revolution, when we go from hunting and gathering to a more permanent civilization, again in quotation marks, the status of women tended to decline. In a hunting and gathering society, if men, and it wasn't all tribes, but in most tribes, men were given the responsibility of hunting, that meant that they were gone for long periods of time. So women were often in positions of leadership in the tribe because they're the ones that stayed with the main settlement of the hunters and gatherers. Even in the nomadic tribes that wandered, the women were given more equality. But once we see the centralization of these high cultures, of these river civilizations, we tend to see that the power of women begins to decline. So there is some negative side here as well. So with the rise of the Egyptians, a couple thousand years later, we see the rise of the Greeks and the Romans. We're going to jump ahead to medieval Europe. So medieval Europe, after the 5th century fall of Rome, medieval Europe for about 1,000 years, life did seem to be quite nasty, British, and short, as Hobbes would suggest life would be in a state of nature. One of the problems in medieval Europe was the water was full of sewage. and waste, and some of the waste would be from the tanneries, and some of the sewage obviously is from man, and I think you can fill in the blanks there. Well, where the water was undrinkable, people still needed to find a source of liquid. So what did they turn to? They turned to beer. So the brewing would remove the microorganisms that made people sick. So there's fecal coliform that would be in the water from the geese and things like that, and from mankind and from the tanneries. And this fecal coliform from the geese and from the people would otherwise be drank. But when you brew the beer, you're boiling the water, and it would remove the fecal coliform. Now, the medieval Europeans didn't realize that, but because of their love of beer, their taste for beer, they're drinking 6 times what we do today per capita per day, not knowing that it was good for them. It just tasted good. It extended their lives. Now, the church itself benefited from this culture of beer. Monks ended up being a big part of the brewing of it, and the promise of beer ended up being that extra incentive that provided, a reason to go to church on Sundays, I guess. And keep in mind, church wasn't just a Sunday thing for many of these villagers. Many of them went nearly every day, and one of the reasons they went was that the church would provide beer after service. So beer was healthy, but beer was also connected to their church-centered society. Please keep in mind, the beer that we're talking about wasn't 5 or 7 or 9% alcohol, it may have been about 1% alcohol. So it's not like that they're going to church and then getting drunk afterwards. Now in Italy, entrepreneurs will see the power that the church is getting from beer, and they're going to want to jump into that industry. So as entrepreneurs in Italy jump into beer creation, this will lead to the creation of capitalism, which will lead to an extension of global trade. And with global trade and global exploration, we find Europeans needing to travel for long periods of time over the water, and the water that they would bring with them would often spoil. So even the settlers and the explorers, as they try to find the passage to India, as they try to find the way to avoid the middleman, way to avoid the Middle East and be able to trade directly to the Chinese and the Indians, as they try to get to Europe, or try to get to Asia, they end up running out of water aboard their ships. So what did they turn to? They had to drink beer, because beer with its alcohol content is not going to spoil. It has been said that America itself will be built by brewers. Men like Washington, Franklin, and Adams were all brewers. In fact, Franklin said, "Beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy." So that's quite the quote. And when you look at the story, the birth story of America a little further, beer becomes a reoccurring part of the story. Originally, the settlers only settled in Plymouth because that's when they ran out of beer, so they went ashore. And when they went ashore, they nearly abandoned their settlements until they noticed the American squirrels' use of acorns, and they decided we might be able to use acorns in our production of beer, and so they do. And it's the squirrel and the acorns that the squirrels are using that will lead to a new American type of beer that will allow them to winter and stay in the Americas. Looking ahead a little bit, the production of beer in the Americas will lead to a Tavern Society, which is a communication network that the documentary would suggest is like a primitive version of the internet. So this is where people would get together in these taverns and discuss ideas and share their visions of the future. And one of these groups in these taverns discussing ideas and visions of the future would be a group called the Sons of Liberty. And they talked about oppression, and they talked about the need for representation, and these Sons of Liberty will be those who lead the American Revolution. So directly involved in the creation of America is beer. In fact, the American anthem used to be a sobriety test, a song that you'd have to sing to show that you're able to drink one more round. Most, I would guess, Americans are no longer aware of that. Looking ahead a little bit, we can see in the 19th century that beer is the basis of modern medicine. That Louis Pasteur wasn't working on milk originally, he was working on beer, and pasteurization, therefore, is a process that resulted from his work with beer. So he had a question. His question was, why does beer sometimes die? Why does it sometimes fail? Why does the beer get sick? And his answer is, because the beer is alive. So, wondering why beer sometimes spoils, he comes up with the idea that beer is actually alive. He discovers bacteria. So mankind discovers bacteria because Louis Pasteur was interested in beer. He's wondering, why does beer go bad? And then he asked the question, if bacteria can make beer sick, can it make man sick? And of course it can, and that will lead to germ theory. And the significance of germ theory is that before germ theory, we often thought the sickness was due to evil spirits. But now with germ theory, we have a foundation of science. And because of science, we can actually cure disease. And therefore, this is instrumental in mankind having maybe not like an advantage over illness, but now we are able to be in a position to save millions of lives. For example, the video tells us that before germ theory, you'd have doctors that would go from working on a cadaver to delivering a baby, and we had a high child mortality rate. A lot of children died, a lot of women died in childbirth because germs might be passed from one patient to another. Because of the germ theory as a response to pasteurization, as a response to beer, doctors realized, what? Maybe we should wash our hands. Maybe we need to wash our hands. So mankind in the 20th century was still being challenged by one of our longest enemies, which is heat. Heat causes our food to rot, it causes us to be uncomfortable, and it can lead to spikes in sickness. This will lead to what we're all very familiar with, which is refrigeration. But why do we have refrigeration? Well, it was the beer industry that ended up funding the scientific research into refrigeration. In the wintertime, they could use ice to refrigerate, but in the summertime, they needed an artificial source of ice. And the reason why they needed refrigeration in the first place is starting in the 1840s with immigrants like Miller and Coors, these new Europeans came to America and they brought with them lager beer. And lager beer needs the fermentation to be controlled by cold temperatures. And that will change the flavor of the beer. And Americans really like the flavor of lager beer. So then they needed to be able to have control over the temperature of the fermentation process. But they needed refrigeration. And they only have access to lots of ice in the wintertime. So what do you do in the summertime? You need beer in the summertime. We need an artificial source of cold, and that'll be refrigeration. So refrigeration is because of beer. Now, we still have more stuff. You might be saying, well, that's got to be it. You can even look at the high standard of living of the American people. The high standard of living of the American people is because of beer. The first mass production wasn't because of Henry Ford's factory. 10 years before that, we had mass production in the beer industry. So within the beer industry, we have Michael Owens in 1904, which invents an automated bottle-making machine. And because of this, he will create mass production. Now, there's always externality with globalization. And the externality here was that in the glass-making industry before his invention, before Michael Owens' 1904 invention, the glass industry relied upon child labor. So beer ends up combating child labor. Finally, we can look at the future of beer. So one of the problems that mankind faces is how are we going to make beer in space? So we need agriculture. And how are we going to drink beer in space? In zero gravity, we're going to have what the video called wet burps. So how do we make flat beer? So by looking at how to enjoy beer in space, we might be able to answer some questions about how can we live, eat, and thrive in space. So in summary, globalization is the interconnectedness of mankind. Often, when we interconnect, we see externality, unintended consequences. So when women are walking along a path and they drop some seeds and they come back a year later and they realize, hey, now the crop has moved over to the path. And then when they're carrying seeds in a bag and it rains and then it gets hot and the seeds make this beer and they drink it and they're like, hey, that's good. Maybe we should actually try to make that on purpose. The unintended consequences of beer is the history of mankind. The documentary suggests that beer is the fuel to the engine of history. And I'll be looking forward to seeing this case study in your essays in the future. All right, so it's going to be lunchtime in about 60 seconds. So now you should pack up. You shouldn't be packing up while I'm delivering the lesson. That's rude. And when we get back from lunch, we will work on ancient globalization a little bit more.